Titled Detour as Method, Serendipitous Discoveries in Confined Terrains. We have with us Huzaafa, who is a PhD candidate in anthropology at Stanford University and a Knight Hennessy Scholar. Her work deals with heritage industries in conditions of long term violence and practices of trade, migration, and displacement. We also have with us Nada Raza, who's the director of the Ulster Arts Foundation, whose PhD research also focuses on transcultural connections, particularly between the Gulf and South Asia, looking closely at the circulation of visual material through trade, migration, cultural intersection, and shifting political alliances. But they're here together today for this particular session because through their work, they have kind of seen these overlaps, especially in terms of, yes, the region, but also in their line of questioning. Um, but for today, they're thinking about how a project evolves when you can't safely be in the same space as your subject. While COVID made remote fieldwork and interviews over Zoom more acceptable, research usually implies some degree of immersion and access. Working across the dividing lines of India and Pakistan and their intersections in the Gulf, Huzaafa and Nada will share how their PhD dissertations have relied instead on finding alternative routes, chasing anecdotes and allyship. Over to you. We'll first start with Huzafa's presentation, moving on then to Nada's. And yeah,
Thank you, Shama. I don't know if the mic's working. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So, what I'm looking to do today is kind of think out loud some of the things I'm working towards, I guess, in the course of my dissertation. None of this is like finalized, figured out. There's no conclusion. It's more a bunch of ramblings and meanderings and just engaging my own personal curiosities and hoping you all will engage with me in this. Um, so, as a background, I'm an anthropologist, and my research is on Kashmiri handicrafts, particularly. For the purposes of this presentation, I've focused on the Kashmiri shawl. For those of you who may or may not be familiar, Kashmir is it's a valley located in the Himalayas. It is also, unfortunately, the site of what is now a 7-decade-long conflict between India and Pakistan. Um, but in addition to all that, it is also my home, um, which means a lot of the stuff that I deal with here is like personally important to me. And in addition to being my home and a conflict zone, and I guess a valley in the Himalayas, and a place and a space, it is also home to what is effectively almost a 600-year plus shawl industry. And while this is a very regional, local, and I've grown up with these, motifs of the shawl industry around me and handicrafts in general, it's a deeply personal and cultural thing, and a regional and in some ways a local thing. But its origins lie, and it's an industry that was born out of Kashmir's connections with Central Asia and Iran. Um, Particularly one of the reigning kings of Kashmir some 600, 500 years ago, um, at some point also brought in very skilled craftsmen from Central Asia who then introduced the local populace to craft. So there's a lot of some stories there, some mythologies there. But why I foreground this is that one of the things that like really sets off my curiosity is the idea of connection, like how we can seemingly see someplace else if you're looking at one place, and just what does it mean to take the freedom and the liberty to follow those connections? Like, does it mean your research is derailed? Does it mean you arrive in new directions? What does that generally mean? So, this is one of those historic connections of Kashmir with Central Asia and Iran in relation to the shawl industry. Then we have this other one that's historically spoken about a little bit, which is somewhere around the 1700s and the 1800s. The Kashmiri shawl becomes this very sought after luxury good within Europe, and it captures the European imagination, and it becomes almost very rooted part of dress for a while. It doesn't last long, but while it does last, her you can see um, this portrait of Josephine Bonaparte, Napoleon's wife, wearing what is effectively a gown made out of a Kashmiri kani shawl, and she also has this maroon other kani shawl draped over her. On the right, we have this 1910 painting by American painter John Sargent Singer, who spent a lot of his time in Europe, actually. Um, and it is titled The Kashmir Shawl. So, this is just to show this kind of emblematic prevalence of Kashmiri shawls within the European imagination during this time. You also find this going on in the Victorian novels and some portrayals there. Um, and this connection kind of like heightened to the point that the factories started emerging within Europe, particularly the UK and France, Norwich, Paisley, so on and so forth, for imitating these shawls and then kind of putting them in the market fast enough so that, you know, the styles could be copied and people would have them. So as you're seeing, all of this that I've discussed so far is basically the stuff for, I guess, historians and art historians, I'm guessing. But I'm an anthropologist. So what do I do if I'm interested in a connection that is dead and long gone? I mean, I wasn't alive in the 1800s. And I don't think as a woman I could have done any of this research anyway. So, um, but here I'm an anthropologist, and what I can work with and what we do work with methodologically is the present. Um, but in my search of the present, what I was not expecting is that I would end up finding my own connections. And this happened accidentally when I was in a workshop in Kashmir in 2021. And what you see here is an image of an artisan who's currently stamping the shawls with dye. And it was in this tiny particular workshop. I asked this person, and I was like, there's a couple of stages involved. These would then be embroidered, washed, sent off finally. And what I got to know is that a whole bunch of like batches that they were making in that particular workshop were going to the Gulf. And to me, that was a connection I had not made thus far. And I didn't think much of it, to be honest, in that moment. Um, but it was in the back of my mind. And then fast forward, um, I was in Dubai in 2022. I wasn't even supposed to be, basically, I was just supposed to be passing through. This was not a destination. But I remember like going through the souks here and seeing like almost being shocked into a certain feeling of home, because these are like, I recognize stitches as something I've grown up with and I've encountered them back home, and to then see them suddenly greeting me in a place where I least expected them. Um and what these objects also led me to were the people who sold them, which was Kashmiri traders. So, the object person connection. And it was through learning through them that I realized how much of like how much these shawls had over time become a part of Khaliji sartorial kind of present. At least that at that point I saw it as a present. Um, and I don't know if for any of you who have been to the global village in the winters, it's there. And so these are things you can locate, whether it's in Qatar, whether it's in the UAE, Kuwait, Saudi, Oman, especially. Um, so what I thought was that, oh, I've discovered a contemporary phenomenon. Is this like the 1800s, but for me? Um, and then I was in Qatar. And to the left is the classic, a trader selling, and there's all these shawls. But on the right, that was in the National Library of Qatar, that I spotted something which was technically, a heritage object and an antique. And I saw it here represented as a part of Qatar's like sartorial history, very rooted in its dress. And I didn't know what that meant at that point. Um, until more recently, to the right is the image I showed you right here, which I took from another angle. Um, But what I was able to locate more recently, and I'm hoping and I believe might be other visual representations, but this is all I've been able to find so far. Um, but it's a 1904 picture of somebody wearing what is very visibly a Kashmiri embroidered shawl as a gutra. Um, and it's not really, as an anthropologist, something that I should be going down, but like just seeing it, it's I am personally very fascinated with the fact that what it would even mean to go down this path further. And what else I can look for in archival materials or what I can learn from people I talk to. Um, but long story short, I've shown you all these slides, and you might very well be wondering, as did I when I was making this presentation, which is what is the point? And I don't know quite what the point is. But what it did lead me to was these kind of questions and reflections that I hope to take forward and would love to also discuss more with you all. Um, One of the first ones being like how anthropological and historical thinking can benefit from geographic and temporal detours. Like if I work on the Kashmiri handicraft industry, does it have to be in Kashmir? Like if we're talking about one place, or do we have to bind ourselves geographically? Do we have to bind ourselves temporally? Like what does it mean to trace a connection? And in no way am I comparing the European connection of the past to this one, but what does it mean to follow, like, or what does it mean to see the present with the same nostalgia that sometimes we see the past with? And how would, anthropologists, how can we work with that? And the second thing that it's making me think is what happens to history when we think outside of Europe? Like, what narrative shifts emerge? There's often like this narrative around, oh, and suddenly once the fashions in Europe ceased, the Kashmiri shawl kind of fell from grace and nobody wanted it anymore. But what does it mean to look at a place where it's still wanted or has become, you know, a part of daily practice or something? And those are still questions I'm thinking with. And the last one is perhaps like the most fun one and just engages my curiosity, uh, which is this idea of serendipity, that how you can find things in unlikely places through unlikely detours. And what does it mean for research to have freedom within institutional bounds or disciplinary bounds to kind of follow down those paths, despite the fact that they might not always take us anywhere. And just as a conclusion, this is a photo. I just took these two photos are from just last month in Kashmir, and what you see on your left is a shawl weaver who is weaving a replica of an 18th century design, which they found on the book to the right. That's not the exact representation, but it's kind of the same. And as I talked about it to one of the people there, and they said how the idea was to create like a collection of heritage shawls. And this idea of like having had its, been at a pinnacle in its European days or whatever is still very much, if I talk to artisans or people in Kashmir, but at the same time, is the idea they do bring forth, oh, this industry came from our connections with Iran or Central Asia. So clearly, those imaginaries are still there. And I guess what I'm trying to figure out and go onward with is like, what happens to this conversation if I bring or if I add the Gulf to the mix? And where do we go from here? And what happens if we put two things together that haven't been put before? And what does that mean for research in general? That's about it.
Thank you, Huzaafa. Can you guys hear me? Okay. And I think your last question about serendipity kind of segues nicely into what I'm going to talk about. And hopefully, through our two presentations, you'll be able to see this kind of methodological messiness that we're both grappling with, where we kind of need each other's toolkits almost. um, and this is, I think,
for me, particularly messy because it's a chapter of my PhD that I'm stuck on. It's exactly the rabbit hole I was told not to go down, but I can't help it. And I think maybe airing it today is also kind of cathartic. um, but my project began as questions that came through looking at works of contemporary art produced in the Sharjah Biennale and the Kochi Biennale that referenced Indian Ocean histories. And my question was, what is this kind of cosmopolitanism that we are yearning for? And did it actually, did it exist? Is there something here that we can hold on to? Or is this kind of need to get beyond the very straitened national borders that we are currently dealing with? And I think Kashmir and Sindh are kind of an interesting mirror in this case, because also, this question of handicraft trade circulation really matter in these geographies. Um, and during COVID, I was not just during COVID, but because Indian visas have become harder for me as a Pakistani, I haven't been able to get to Kochi. Obviously, I have a very long chapter on Sharjah that I've been able to develop while I've been here. But during COVID, I was spending a lot of time in Pakistan and ended up traveling through Sindh and sort of encountered something which I'm still kind of working out and will share with you. And it was interesting for me that the detour kind of led me home to a geography that I had grown up 2 hours away from, right? And also the kind of iconography that I will talk about is also very current, and this is a figure that has been coming up, and I've been finding him. It's almost as if once you get attuned to looking for something, you start seeing it everywhere. And so, in contemporary art projects, particularly in Pakistan, this figure of this Sindhi god has become something that's become quite topical. So this is an image of the Jhulelal. It's a virtual image of the Jhulelal Tirat Dham, which is partly built in Gujarat by the Sindhi community of Bombay. And their aspirations are because, at partition, a large number of Sindhi Hindus were displaced. They were already a mercantile trade community with a small diaspora, but there's a large number of them, for instance, across the Gulf, particularly in the UAE. And then also, of course, in Bombay. But they are building this temple to what is considered a uniquely Sindhi god or deity at this point, which is as close to Sindh or as close to Karachi as they are able to get. So there's a lot of kind of evocation of not just the geographic, but this idea that Muslims have Makkah and Sindhis have no home to return to, so they need to kind of build this new center. And obviously, there's a long and complex political history around this that I won't get into. But this is the kind of current version of the deity, which is in the partly built temple. And so you see, this figure seated on the palla or hilsa fish. The hilsa fish is native to the Indus River. There's a lot of mythology around the fish because it swims upstream in order to breed. And he's seated on a lotus leaf and is holding, it's unclear if he's holding a scroll or a book. But he's holding this, what I find quite a puzzling object. And I became really interested in the different evocations I had seen of who is known commonly as Jhule Lal. Jhula is swing, Lal is beloved. And the mythology around I guess this figure originates along the Indus River. So as I started kind of delving into the communities and histories of Jhulelal, I got incredibly confused. I sort of stumbled across this thing which defied everything I knew, and it was like an hour away from where I had grown up, right? So this is Uderolal in southern Sindh, which is this shrine where you have both a temple and a shrine, and it is shared by the Hindu and Muslim communities. It was built in let's say, late 17th, early 18th century, probably. It's been renovated a few times. Um, and in here, you have different evocations of the god, but there is a shrine to Sheikh Tahir, who is also known as Zinda Pir, so the living god, and Jhulelal. And there's a sort of collusion between these two deities, and this kind of lack of clarity about dates and where he's from and who he was is accepted by everybody. So there's two versions. Sheikh Tahir, who was a Muslim Sufi saint who had protected the Hindu community, or Jhulelal, who had fought the Muslim governors of Sindh. So Islam arrived in Sindh in 732 AD, according to the official Pakistan studies textbooks. And so there was this kind of negotiation that happens consistently with whoever is ruling. And Jhulelal is meant to have stood up to Mirak Shah, who was then the ruler, to refuse to convert. And obviously was victorious, and therefore there had been this kind of, I don't want to call it communal harmony, but this coexistence, let's say, for a few centuries within Sindh. What is even more fascinating is that the sect that really are the kind of devotees of Jhulelal come from the Daryapanthi or Nanakpanthi sect. There's a temple in the Indus River called Sadh Belo that I was able to visit, where the story is that one of the many grandchildren of Guru Nanak, who's the leader of the Sikh community, came to this place to establish this monastery. So there's a Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh kind of syncretism that happens in these spaces, which was, I'm embarrassed to say, was eye-opening for me because it had been under my nose all this time. And so I traveled through Shikarpur and Sakkar and kept kind of running into this kind of popular printed image of the man on the fish with the lotus leaf holding a scroll. And I became really obsessed with like finding the oldest one that I could particularly find, which is hugely challenging because every time someone's wishes are granted, they renovate the temple or the shrine. So if you look at the most current versions, they're completely covered in sort of cheap commercially produced tiles, and the original deities have vanished. So, this was a kind of a lot of guesswork and a lot of serendipity and knocking on people's doors that led me to all these different images. And in Shikarpur, I found that, and a lot of these houses have now been destroyed. So every time you go back, there's less and less material to see. But this would have been the door of a Daryapanthi home, which you see in the second image is, and it's a bit unclear, I'm sorry, I was too short to get this properly, is an image of Guru Nanak, which would have been on a Nanakpanthi house, and then a Muslim house would have had a floral kind of non-representational image. And so homes in Shikarpur would have been, or areas would have been delineated by the types of motifs that you found on the architecture. This was in Sadh Belo. So, there's the image of Jhulelal, the scroll has disappeared, the headdress is different, and the fish appears almost like this kind of image below. And I should say that for those familiar or unfamiliar with the representations of the kind of central Hindu pantheon, every god does have his kind of animal vehicle. So they often appear, it's not unusual for them to appear riding some sort of animal escort. But this was interesting because they were separated. And then I began to find these images of a man with a turban holding a stick, actually standing on a fish. And again, the temple was being renovated, and all of these fragments had been discarded and kind of laid to the side, and not signed or dated, which for me in my discipline is impossible. um, but kind of, was almost leading me in some kind of direction. And I think this is, one of the kind of clearest images that I found, which was actually within a Sikh. It's not quite a Gurudwara, but it's a gathering place for the community in Shikarpur. Has really fascinating mythology of its own, but was a deeply sort of syncretic space, and still continues to be. And of course, the Sikh community in Sindh is minuscule now, so it's also a kind of neglected space. But that, of course, led me, like all roads lead back to the British Library, is how I feel sometimes about. And we can talk a bit more about the decolonial within research and the fact that mostly the material we need always turns up in those collections. Or the challenge of the only credible sources because there's a published date, and then we're forced to always return to those images. But as I started doing visual searches, the first image is from like a composite image, which was on a Sufi website. And this image, which is in the V&A's collection, and I would question this dating, and like I haven't quite figured out why this was from the Punjab, but I have a little bit of work to do here. But which leads us to this image of Khaja Khizr, who is very much from the Islamic pantheon, and a Sufi figure, who, of course, comes from the same kind of watery, belief systems, but is at different times in different religions, the man in green has sort of appeared as a figure of the immortal, but also very deeply linked to the idea of water as the elixir of life. And so there is this kind of, it's just opened up this huge muddle of questions for me about how these things intersect. But the question for me now is, why do we assume that these things don't intersect? These were incredibly cosmopolitan places. I think the other big surprise for me is the kind of modernity of these iterations, right? That a lot of this material was actually circulating and popular in the 19th century. And I thought I would find some like ancient god, but actually most of the representations seem to be at the time of encounter with the West and at the time of a lot of these kind of deep communal negotiations happening. And so this is the kind of tomb we think of Zindapir in Sakhar. So, this kind of very lively interchange between Zindapir, Jhulelal, Khaja Khizr still exists. And the moment you start to ask questions, it's kind of like, dude, you just have to believe, like don't get too attached to this. But at the same time, there is this question of, okay, how did we get from the man standing on the fish to the seated figure? And here is where I'll get into deep conjecture and this kind of way of just looking and constantly seeing things and speculating on what encounters may have happened, even when you don't have proofs. And then you just sit there and wait for somebody to write the book or find the thing that you need. So this is an image of Jupiter from the Kitab al-Bulhan, which is an Iraqi text which has circulated, the Book of Wonders, basically, which has circulated very widely. But of course, I found it in the British Library. And actually, while flipping through a book called The Lost Maps of the Caliphs, which is this incredible kind of text about this manuscript that is now in the Bodleian Library, where literally I was flicking through and was like, wait, I've seen this somewhere before. So it may be through the circulation of images such as this, but it may also be, and this is again me looking at that image and saying, I've seen this somewhere before. And I had seen a Netsuke in the collection of the LACMA, the Los Angeles Museum, of Kinko Senin, who is also a riverine deity, riding a carp, holding a scroll. And I think for me, the key to this is the scroll, because it's not, it's not the Guru Granth Sahib, it's not the Quran, it's a very particular form. And I'm hoping that there might be somebody from the Sindhi community in the Gulf whose great grandfather went to Japan and collected netsuke and brought them back to Shikarpur. It's like I have to kind of, dream up this person or invent them as a kind of proof. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of share where I am stuck and how these kind of detours sort of happen, and you have to at some point finish the damn PhD and and end it. But so much of art historical method relies on that kind of very close looking. And when I started my project, the question that my peers at the Courtauld, which is a very stuffy, it's being recorded, institution, perceived to be stuffy, but not actually institution, because they do take in people like me, is, they kept saying, but you need to learn anthropological ethics in order to do interviews, assuming that because I was working on something non-Western, and also assuming that there wouldn't be enough published material, that I would have to work from that methodology. And so I've been resisting that and saying, no, I'm going to work from the material itself. But I think that leads us to a good place to start chatting. And what we thought is we'd kick off a few things and then open it up to the group.
Cool. So yes, one of the things, like as you were speaking, that just and was actually the flow of the whole presentation, is like it's almost stumbling onto something which will, and then keep on following it. What do you think will happen if you give it up? Like as the say committee or people sometimes want you to not go down that path. Versus alternately, what are you expecting will happen if you keep at it and keep on going?
I mean, the obvious question is I'll never finish, but or the obvious answer, sorry. No, I think there's a point at which you have to park it and say, I'm going to close it off here, and this is the next project, right? And come at it from there. But I also think there is something, in the same way that every time somebody works on this terrain, and I lean very heavily on the work of anthropologists in Sindh, is because it's become a sort of livelier field, it is about kind of creating that field, right? And being a part of a community of scholars who are asking the same questions. I think that's the opening that you're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something I also resonate in mind, because one of the things I'm like really, really stuck on and just can't give up is that 1904 photo I found, which kind of tells me that, oh, this is because in my initial assessment, the idea was, oh, because that's what a lot of traders were telling me. There's often a presentist bias that we have in our lives. And it was, oh, yeah, because Kashmiri traders started emerging here more in the 1990s once the armed conflict erupted and tourism was bad, so there was a lot of displacement associated with the conflict. And that's how the traders came here. And in a lot of like those conversations, it was like, oh, the traders came and then the object came. But then when you look at something from 1904, you're like, there's something else going on. And for me, not as a historian, there is a point at which I have to be like, okay, this can just be, a footnote or an additional image. Whereas I do have to focus more on like, even if this happened or didn't happen, or what are the kind of conversations this sparks amongst the living people I know? Like, how do they view these cross cultural imaginings or don't? Um, But yeah, I increasingly find myself slipping some days into history or art history and not knowing what to do when I'm there.
Yeah. I think one of the things actually that I wanted to also point towards, because you showed the image but didn't talk about it, is the map. So maybe if we can go back to that object. So Huzaafa and I met to talk about our presentations, but spent most of our afternoon drooling over this shawl that's in the background.
It's um it's called the Map Shawl of Srinagar. Srinagar is the capital city of Kashmir. It's also my hometown, and it's in the 1800s there were almost 3 or 4 of these made, and what you see is like on the pashmina fabric, like it's deeply intricate weaving and stitching, and each of these are said to have taken about 30 years to complete, and that's not just one artisan, that would have been multiple. And I wish I could zoom it, but the details are insane. Like the blue line you see going through is River Jhelum, that is like the major river that runs through Kashmir. And if you go up and over, you see the Dal Lake and the Nagin Lake. So it's very, you see the major bridges over Jhelum. So it's also very cartographically, I mean, it is inspired and it's an interpretation. And you see all these like caravans on boats that have the Maharaja and so on and so forth. Um, but as someone who's obsessed with like objects and placemaking through them, but also locating them in other places, I find it really fascinating to like for artisans to have undertaken a cartographic exercise through a map, sorry, through a textile. Um, and I think something that came up was, yeah, I think it's the power I feel sometimes these objects have over me, although I can't talk to them and they can't talk back. And this one's also in a British museum, as most things are. Um, but I guess one of the things that came up when I was speaking with Nada was that she told me about how, was it Surat, that there were also
It's a
these
map of
cotton
Surat, yeah. I mean, so it's also here, you can see the mosque, the temple, the Sufi shrine, like all of those things are delineated. And I'd been looking at this map of Surat, which I found in a museum. So Surat is in Gujarat, but I found it in a museum in Jaipur. And all the Persianate names had been not crossed out, but had been annotated in Devanagari. And so apparently, when Jaipur was being built, the Maharaja was collecting these maps of other cities to study how they had been socially organized. And Gujarat was particularly fascinating because the cities had a very clear, just like I showed you in Shikarpur, that you knew whose house it was. These cities are divided into poles, which are divided by both caste and class, and so there was a kind of, you know, from the 1930s we've been told Hindus and Muslims can't live together, but there were these hundreds of years of actually living together, and we are through these materials figuring out what that looked like or what that felt like, or it kind of opens up these other ways of thinking and possibilities. Should we open up to the floor? But say what you're saying.
Oh, Neha has a question there.
Go ahead. Thanks.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you guys. This is really amazing. The way that both of your projects are resonating with each other is really fascinating to me. I and I don't know how coherent this question is going to be, but when I did my research here, a lot of the merchants that I spoke to were Sindhi merchants, and some of them came from families where they became either Pakistani or Indian because they were already here in the Gulf when partition happened. So I'm kind of wondering, kind of building off of your work, Nada, like thinking about this syncretism, like, is there something about the Gulf here and the way, especially within the merchant communities, that Hindus and Muslims engage each other, that maybe can be a site of like a political challenge or something like that to the original story that you're telling about, oh, we have to build this temple in Gujarat because, we have no other place, et cetera, et cetera. Because there's, so much of this like Hindu nationalism that has kind of seeped into Hindu identity, right? In here as well. But I'm just kind of wondering if you're seeing anything in your travels, and especially within Sindhi communities or even other communities in the Gulf, where there is more of a challenge to this political attempt to divide us.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the underlying project, if that makes sense. But again, because I'm not an anthropologist, it's also a place that it's not easy for me to go. And so somehow I have consistently missed the Cheti Chand, which is the festival of Julelal celebration that happens here. Through years of COVID, but because also those dates keep shifting. And it's also not so easy to find if you're not Sindhi, right? But again, it's also about memory, right? And I feel like there is a kind of re-narrativization that has happened or is starting to happen. One of the foundation's researchers, Lubna Ansari, who very sadly is not here today, has been looking at Hindu-Muslim intimacy in the Gulf, particularly looking at how things are changing, right? So that there is this period where the Gulf is certainly this third place where even families are reunited or uninterrupted, and particularly for the Sindhi Gujarati community, this becomes the Boris, this becomes a kind of third node by which people can continue to circulate. But that is now starting to change, right? There is this kind of creep that is starting to happen. And from both sides. I don't think it's entirely to do with Hindu nationalism or political Islam in Pakistan. But there is certainly, this was certainly a place of possibility and a place where intermarriages could thrive and so on. But I think there is research to be done and observation, kind of still ongoing on how those lines are always shifting. Sure, of course.
Also, it's for Huzaafa, because I feel like this is a similar thing here, right? In terms of like how are Kashmiris defining themselves vis-a-vis in the Gulf, vis-a-vis the way that they would define themselves in the occupied Kashmir, or whether they identify as Pakistani or Indian, etc. So I was just maybe ask you a similar question to that and what you're finding. And then also if you're finding, we see Kashmir everywhere in the Gulf, especially like in Omani headdress and things like that. But do you see the Gulf in Kashmir?
Yeah, those are excellent questions. I think for the first part, yes, I think one of the things I have found in my research, and that was surprising and heartwarming, was this case of a family who are both ancestrally Kashmiris, but one is in the Indian side of it and the other in the Pakistani side of it. And they own a handicraft store together, which is something, you can do in a third space or a third place. So it is that kind of space that enables those connections to kind of be reignited in ways that are not politically feasible everywhere or in every context or, within every narrative. And to the second question of seeing Kashmir in the Gulf and not see, or do I see Gulf in Kashmir? I think that's what's been fascinating to me and why I think I'm pushing this kind of lens a bit more, because I did not until the person casually mentioned, oh, all of these are going to the Gulf. And at that point in another shawl workshop, what they were working on was was a bunch of them to be sent to Oman, and they were not something you produce for the Kashmiri market, because it was a set. It was a headdress and a belt, which is something Omanis wear. Um, and so it was only through that that I've increasingly now started to be aware of more of these connections. And up until then, if I were to be honest, I did not. Now I see it a lot more because when I went back this time and I was talking to some traders, even traders who have in the course of their trading lives spent time in other cities in India. Um, I didn't know it before, but you talk to them, and at some point, whether they went or not, they had been thinking about going to Dubai because their company also has a shop here or something. Um, and I think that's a very interesting question for me because when it comes to Kashmir historically, I'm very interested in like disentangling it from the South Asian categorization, which it's always put into, and thinking what happens or what are what are the creative sparks we can arrive at if we think of it with Central Asia or with Iran. Um, and now, in the current geopolitical imaginings that have existed, at least in this state post 1947, right? Like, um, I think the question that really becomes also pertinent as an anthropologist is if, because the Indian Ocean world is something that's been historically very studied. And if you look at those connections, India looks towards the Gulf or has looked, and the Gulf has looked towards India and so on. And it's very curious how Kashmir, in its current dynamics, where it is looking towards India or looking towards Pakistan, how it looks towards Gulf through that. Um, but yeah, it's a very new kind of awareness for me. But I honestly am on the lookout for finding the Gulf in Kashmir more these days.
Chinasa.
Thank you both for your presentation. The I have well, there was something interesting about the discussion around art history, and specifically around the history of craft, and the sort of like if you studied fine art, you probably would have been taught about William Morris and the Victorian era and the hierarchies between art, and where craft sits. So I wondered if both of you could talk a bit more about sort of the decolonial methodology that you're employing by also looking at artifacts that relate to, craft skills and processes that many people don't get to hear about or read about in the West. And also, Nada, I was interested in what you were saying about the kind of the everything leads back to the British Library. I'm intrigued by that because in many ways you're presenting like artistic artifacts that are religious and cultural, but also you're also in some ways also presenting a conundrum, which is where is this thing originating from in terms of the symbolism. So I'm intrigued by the decolonial methodology.
Um, I mean, the kind of obvious constraints for me have been attribution, right? And it doesn't matter whether these things are in British collections or lying on the ground. It's impossible now to know who made them and exactly when, right? Which, as in the discipline of art history, makes it actually an unusable object theoretically, right? um, because because that is the kind of way in, or those are the kind of methods of the discipline. But I think it is pushing against that, right? It's precisely saying, well, actually, no, I'm going to insist on looking at this thing. And there isn't a clear line. And there isn't a clear line because guess what? You displaced all these objects, right? So the fact that it is out of context in the first place is only the beginning of the problem, right? And there's always been, I'll never forget as an undergraduate wanting to work on South Asian art history in the US. And this very senior scholar kind of looking at me straight in the eye saying, you can't do it because we don't have those works in the museums and the books don't exist. Right? So I was forbidden at a very young stage. And then I had to, it like took me 20 years to get here and I'm still stuck. Right? So it is a problem. But again, I feel like, forums like this of people coming together and kind of, pecking at these things together is one way of finding strategies that can contest convention.
Others. I have some questions, but before something crossed my mind, like applying what your concern is about the origin of the objects and the research and where it is, the origin of it and when the timing. Maybe if we look in our time now, what's happening around us in the region, in the wars, the first thing they do, they go to the museums and they stole. And then nobody knows where it is. After like 10 years, they said, from Iraq, we found it in London Museum, and someone did that. So I don't think someone will tell you how, when, and who made it, because it seems that it doesn't help them, no matter. My question is for you, Nada, is what is the meaning of the fish in your? Did you get the meaning of the fish in those objects first? And can you think that object as a place could be also object as ambassador to the country and the origin? Could be the object as ambassador because it talks about identity, no matter who can stole it, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of weight of this kind of symbolism, right? I mean, the fish in many different cultures at many different times has meant different things, but there's always a sort of association with, let's say, fecundity and fertility I mean, the fish is deeply symbolic, I think, in Christian symbolism, for instance. So I think it's one of those symbols that really does cross. But in this case, it's very specific to the river Indus. To the river Indus that flows, yeah. So that specific river, it's a specific fish with a specific kind of trajectory and significance to that community because it is one of the sources of not just food and livelihood, but has a kind of spiritual significance, right? Yeah, I think it's one of those symbols which I started looking into and then realized that it was actually quite specific and that I couldn't actually connect through that alone. And it was actually kind of particular. But, I was struck when I saw the Netsuke of why does the Hilsa look like a carp, right? And so those are questions which become more iconographic rather than about the kind of, I think it's more than an origin thing. I think origin is not the precise term. It's much more about kind of figuring out the evolution of the thing. So I think maybe for me, what's been helpful even in making this presentation today is flipping it and starting from the present rather than trying to start from like a starting point, if that makes sense.
I don't want to add to that. Just, I think particularly to your point about like object as an ambassador to the country, because oftentimes a lot of these are related to identity, and I think it also connects to Chinasa's comment on decolonial methodology. I think one of the things I struggle with personally in my research is always at one point you are trying to connect objects to people's identity, because if it's a heritage thing, if it's a heritage industry, or if it has religious, cultural, or deeply symbolic meanings, it's of course very rooted in a community, and that means it's very rooted in an identity. But then historically, there's also often been the danger where we equalize people with their objects. And nowhere do you see it more than like colonial fantasies. Say, the for example, you take Britain and you take exhibitions and these curio cabinet and cabinets of curiosity, where you would just, you take an object, I don't know, an ivory elephant from carved in India, and you put it in a cabinet and you're like, oh, I've been to India. This is what India is all about. So I think personally I always struggle with that balancing line between, oh, this is a Kashmiri object, but this is not all that Kashmir is. Um, and then to like, yeah, go into that conversation similarly, because as it is a contentious conflict zone, there are also other soft diplomacies within which, for example, Kashmiri textiles do get and historically, are sometimes grouped as Indian textiles, which some people would take issue with. So there are all those like kind of, it is about identity, but not so much that the people are just nothing more than these objects. So it's, yeah, something I struggle with, like to aptly decolonize, but also to retain that thing, as you're mentioning, that these objects in some way, shape, or form are representative of particular identities or communities.
Excuse my stupid questions, but you said you were talking Kashmiri shawls. Are you referring to pashminas, or because you go to Pastakia or Islamic in Sharjah, it's like pashmina? Is that what you're referring to? Because I saw the mango motif, which is very common in India. Are there certain motifs common to Indian Kashmir versus Pakistani Kashmir, or it's the same thing?
It's mostly the same thing, in the sense of the motif. For example, the one you're referring to, like the mango, within the Indian, it's often known as ambi, but within Kashmiri ideas, it's more like butter, like an almond.
Mm-hmm.
But there are historically, if you like any literature you read, there is like some reference to like the butter as originating as a Persian motif, and then making its way. So again, all those delineated connections. But to your other question of the pashmina, what I'm
Is that what you're
is that-
referring to, the pashmina, or is it something else?
in a way, yes. Because pashmina is a particular form of cashmere, and it has a geographical indication tag, and it's from the first step unto the last step, and there are about 36 stages involved in the manufacture of a project, and some of them can take 2 to 3 years. And that thing historically was known as pashmina. Today, like everything, I think this brings us closer also to the question of authenticity and
Because it's so
imitation
commercial,
and-
so I don't know what is really a Kashmir shawl. I just know pashminas. I don't know what the Kashmir.
So Kashmiri shawls are pashminas, but there are also Khani shawls. There are different designs. Pashmina within the Western colloquial, more recently, in the last couple of decades, also now just a style of shawl, which is like a shawl with fringes at the edges. And I think that's one of the things, I didn't touch upon it in this, but when I do think about it, like one of the things I think with, especially with traders and how they sell it or how they have to navigate it, especially within a market where there is a lot of fakes and imitations, which, as we saw, is not a new thing now. It happened in like 1800s in Europe as well. But it is this labor of translation, to like to operate in a realm where you're throwing out a word which means different things to different people, and all through that you have to make a sale, or sometimes to claim for one thing that it is another, and that you take the origin stories or mythologies attributed to the original, quote unquote, whatever that is, and post them onto these. So honestly, I think I have a lot of writing to do about what is a Kashmiri shawl or what is a pashmina, in particularly how scholarship sees it, but how everyday people see it, or how, what does it mean to be sold a pashmina for like 40 dirhams, which is not a pashmina. But then the way these words get used, and then I think one of the things that really makes me think about always is cultural translation, and that, like, yeah, what happens when people get involved and how messy it can get.
Sorry, Nada, I had a question. Sorry if I didn't understand what you're trying to look at, but you were talking about Sind. Are you referring to the civilization, to the deity, or to the religion? Because the figure you were showing, I could see Sikh, Sufi, Hindu gods in the same figure. Like the fish, for me, the first thing that came to mind in Lebanon, on some cars, people just have the fish picture indicating they're part of a certain Christian. That's
Yeah.
the first thing that
Yeah.
came to my mind. When with the text, I thought of a Gurudwara. I even saw some Jain references there. With some things, I saw Sufism. So the Sindhis, what did they believe in? Like, do they have a ethnicity, or is it a combination? And or I was just confused.
Yeah.
What are you looking for exactly?
So, I think the Sindhi question is too big for me to answer, but it is precisely that confluence that is fascinating, right? The fact that this is a now displaced community that belong to a part of the world that through trade, through Indian Ocean trade, but also the Silk Route, meeting the Indian Ocean in Shikarpur, let's say from the, from the 16th to the 19th centuries, was this incredibly lively place, which now has kind of fallen out of view.
But it was a civilization. It was a
It was an entrepot. It was a center. It was a really important center for banking, for trade. It has one of the oldest covered bazaars. It has had incredible architecture. But
all in mostly in Pakistan.
now in Pakistan, right? Now in Pakistan. And because the kind of affluent mercantile community are forced to leave at partition, it sort of falls out of view. And the kind of, as Neha was saying, the Sindhi diaspora resettles, particularly in the Gulf, and the trade continues, but the continuity of kind of reference to these sites and images is broken, right? And which is why I think it's been difficult for me to find a community to speak to the objects that I'm looking at.
It's a big diaspora, and there's no
Exact-
common on it.
No. So there is now this kind of contemporary reinvention and attempt with the image of the temple that I showed to create a new center. But from the research I've been doing, there's a kind of material and imaginative loss, right, that has happened through the nationalisms that we now have to negotiate.
So this is because of lots of civilizations, because like Amritsar is Sikh, Mecca, Islam.
That's the way we think,
Yeah.
but that's not how circulation necessarily worked. These were cosmopolitan spaces. They were mercantile communities. There was a lot of borrowing and kind of accommodation that was clearly taking place.
There were traders.
Yeah.
Just for the reference of carp, it just reminds me of Iraq, because carp, Tigris, Euphrates, carp is a very important part
Possibly.
of Mesopotamian culture. So when you think of the fish, I thought of Mesopotamia as well.
Yeah. No, thank you for that.